Tales from the Crypt by Jack Oleck. Narrated by Chris Harvey. Joanne managed to scream once, just once, before those hands closed about her throat and dirty thumbs clamped down on her windpipe. The last thing of which she was aware was the radio. Happy Christmas to all, and to all a good night. Joanne came out of her trance slowly. The monk's eyes were still fixed on hers. She spoke automatically, without thinking. Nonsense! I have no intention of... Haven't you? The monk did not wait for a reply. He seemed to have forgotten her. His basilisk stare was on Maitland. And you? You said that you were in a hurry. Why were you in such a hurry? I'm on my way home to my wife and children. It was difficult for Maitland to mouth the words. And then? The monk's hollow voice had changed, become almost a caress. It made Maitland shudder. It was as though the cowled and hooded figure behind the stone table could read his mind. And then? The monk's eyes caught Maitland's, held them. Maitland could see nothing, think of nothing but those eyes. Then they receded, vanished, and he remembered. Try as he might, Maitland could not bring himself to finish packing the suitcase. His other bag, a mate to the one on the bed before him, had somehow not seemed so final. He had packed it quickly and taken it downstairs at once, eager to be gone. It waited now in the hall just by the front door, just as it had waited on so many other nights when he had lied to his wife, he thought, and wished that he could forget his sense of guilt. For the third time he began to rearrange the things in the suitcase. Shirts just so, toilet case in a corner, neckties flat so that they would not wrinkle. What was the matter with him? But he knew what was the matter with him. He had always known. Buried deep down in some hidden, locked-away corner of his mind there had always been the knowledge of his own weakness. It was clamouring to get out, to be heard, and he knew that if he listened, he would waver and surrender. But he would not listen. It wasn't as if he meant to hurt anyone. What was happening had long since passed out of his control. A man had to do what he had to do. He had the same right to happiness as anyone else. If grasping at that happiness meant that others would suffer, there was no help for it. This time he closed the suitcase, snapped its lock shut, and lifted it purposefully from the bed. The next few moments would be a trial, and before he left the bedroom he looked into a mirror to make certain that his expression revealed no faintest trace of the indecision within him. The children would be no problem. They would take him at face value. But his wife was another matter. When a woman has been married to a man for 11 years and she loves the man, she comes to know and instantly identify every shade of expression that crosses his face. Satisfied, he carried the suitcase downstairs to the hall, set the suitcase beside its twin, locked his face into a smile and went into the living room. His wife and the children were waiting. The boy, 8 years old and filled with energy, was first into his arms. The girl, a year younger, followed close behind. He would miss them. When they had kissed him, the girl clung to his hand. She favoured her mother. There was the same trusting look about her, the same unquestioning affection. Must you go, Daddy? I'm afraid so. Maitland's smile remained glued in place as he ruffled her hair. Daddy has business to attend to. The girl pouted. But you always have business. No, don't pester Daddy, his wife said, and added to him, Can't you wait until morning?" Maitland wondered fleetingly if something about his smile had caught her eye, but there was no suspicion in the way she looked at him. "My appointment's in the morning. I'll have to drive all night to make it." "Well, when will you be back?" He had been dreading the question. Most of his time for the past hour had been spent in phrasing and rephrasing his answer. It was the measure of his resolve that the reply, the lie, came easily to his lips. "I don't know. Have to see how it goes. I'll phone you when I get there." "Well, you better take your gloves and a coat. It's cold out for this time of year." They're in the car. Even now he knew he could call off his leaving, make some excuse. Instead he kissed her. "Well, goodbye, darling." The children clamoured to be kissed again too. He kissed each in turn. "Goodbye. You be good now." There was no hesitation in his step when he went back down the hall to the front door and picked up the suitcases and went out. So far as his wife and the children could see, this was merely a replay of a scene he had played often in the past few months. There was, however, one difference. Outside he hesitated, then set down the suitcases and turned to look at the door. His finger touched the card in its metal frame above the doorbell, traced out the name Maitland printed on it. It had been a happy moment when he had first slipped the card into its frame. The mask that he had been wearing melted away, replaced by a look of worry and uncertainty. To his right, the living room spilled brilliance through its big bay window. Inside, his wife had seated herself in his easy chair, and the children were climbing into her lap. She always read to them before putting them to bed. The scene held him, tugged at him. He had expected that this moment would be painful, but he had not anticipated just how painful it would really be. He had an impulse to go back into the house. No. His wife was a capable woman. She and the children would manage. Somehow. The gloves he pulled on as he sat behind the wheel were a pair his wife had given him for his last birthday, but he did not think of that. It was a great deal easier, once he had turned the ignition key and left the house behind, to put his family out of his thoughts. By the time he had reached the street on which Susan lived, he had once again managed to convince himself of the rightness of what he was doing. He'd given his family a lot of good years, hadn't he? When he pulled up in front of the sleek building in which Susan had her apartment, he could see her window. Her lights were on. She was waiting, as he had known that she would be. Only at her door, before he pushed the bell, did another momentary pang of guilt pass through him. The name card above the bell that spelled out Susan's last name, Blake, reminded him of things he wanted to forget, of the card above his own doorbell. Susan opened the door, and his momentary pang of renewed guilt left him. But he did not at once take her into his arms, nor did she seem to expect that he would. They were both under a strain. She had not been altogether certain that he would come even at the very last moment, and there was relief in her eyes when he walked into the living room. The room, except for her own suitcases by the door, was empty, stripped, and his footsteps echoed. She knew at once, when she had followed him and he was holding her, that he was emotionally drained. His kiss was almost perfunctory. "I see that you managed," he said. "The movers came this morning. Everything will be up there waiting for us." Susan, too, was a capable woman. Maitland made a little grimace at the mental comparison. "Is something wrong?" "No, of course not." The bare apartment depressed him. He was anxious to leave. "We'd best get going. We've got a long drive ahead of us." He moved as though to take her suitcases. She smiled at him. "We'll have more than enough time now." Her eyes flicked over the empty room. "It seems a shame to give up such a good apartment like this. It took me months to find it." We both had to give up a lot. There was no mistaking Maitland's meaning. He had had second thoughts then. "Did you tell her?" Maitland did not look at her. "No." "I see." "No, you don't see." Maitland forced himself to be almost angry. His own cowardice had risen up like a spectre to confront him, and there was no other way to blot it out. The children were still awake. I couldn't. I'll call her when we get there." There was a tinge of annoyance in her voice as she recognized the cowardice. "Don't you think that will be a bit, well, cruel? When a man leaves, it can wait." Maitland bit off the words. This was no way to begin a new life. "I'll take your things down to the car." He picked up the suitcases. "You coming?" Susan followed him to the door, but there she could not resist turning just for a moment to look back. She too was starting out upon a new life. In the elevator they did not speak. The silence was awkward, yet neither of them felt the inclination to break it. Locked each in their own thoughts, they were contemplating what was to come. The bright future that they had planned together, now that it had actually begun, seemed somehow tarnished. On the street, Maitland went to the rear of the car. "You get in. I'll put the bags in the trunk." It was an unnecessary admonition, but he felt the need to say something, to ease the tension that had sprung into being between them. She was already in her seat when he climbed into the car beside her and made a small ritual of pulling on the gloves that he had removed before going up to her apartment. That annoyed her too. It was such an obvious device for delaying the inevitable. She watched him tug on the gloves, smooth each finger in turn. Second thoughts? The question took him by surprise. He had not thought her so shrewd. Not a one. "Why do you ask?" "Just a feeling." "You know better than that." He wanted to say more, to reassure her, but the cowardice was there in him. He did feel guilty. His family did need him. Well, they would just have to shift for themselves. The car was well out of the city before he spoke again. His gloved hands, tight on the wheel at first, had relaxed, and the steady drone of the motor, the endless ribbon of road stretching ahead into the night, had lulled him into a reflective mood. Your life is strange, isn't it? A man leads an ordinary, respectable, bourgeois existence for years. Then suddenly, a girl comes into his life, and he leaves everything for her. But he's a coward, so he finds a new job, secretly. He leaves, secretly. He wanted Susan to understand the emotions that had made him hesitate, that had drained him, made him so weary. He had wavered, yes, but not seriously, not really. There had never been any real doubt in his mind that he would leave, that he would be able to turn his back on his family. Better not pursue that line of thought. The past was over and done with. The important thing now was Susan. What had he been saying? Oh yes, about leaving. He took his eyes from the road long enough to look at her tenderly. But it will be worth it, for both of us. I love you, Susan. And I love you. You're sure? You're not sorry? That was the coward talking again. His weariness seemed to work like a catalyst, dredging the uncertainty up out of his subconscious no matter how he tried to hide it, to fight it down. I'll never be sorry. As long as you aren't. Of course you won't. I shouldn't have asked. The car's tires made a kind of music on the concrete highway. He was even more worn out than he had thought. His hand brushed over his eyes. There was something strange about the fatigue that had invaded him. Something surreal. You're tired, Susan said. Why don't you let me take over? No, I'm all right. I think you'd better. Your eyes are closing. He could feel the heaviness dragging his eyelids shut. Awake, he felt as though he were already asleep. Carl, don't you think we'd better stop? I'll drive. You can take a nap. You look as though you could use one. Yes, perhaps I'd better. His own voice came to him as if from far away, faintly. He was hardly conscious of tooling the car to the shoulder at the side of the road, of braking. You are tired. Susan's voice, too, was far away, and there seemed to be lead weights attached to his eyelids. The slam of the door behind him was the last thing he heard after she had slid over to the driver's side and he had gotten in beside her. He was asleep almost instantly, slumped down in the leather seat with his head leaning back against the rest. But it was a troubled sleep. After a while he moaned and Susan glanced at him sharply. His mouth was working as though he were speaking soundlessly, and there was a frightened look on his face. "Carl?" His answer was another moan. "Carl?" Perhaps it would be best to wake him. She thought for a moment and decided against it. Her foot pressed down on the accelerator. The sooner they reached their destination, the better. Maitland was rolling his head from side to side. His voice cut through her like a knife. "No. No. No!" Suddenly he was sitting bolt upright, wide awake, his eyes open and staring. For a moment his face remained twisted with the memory of something horrible. Then, as he began to realize where he was, that it had only been a dream that had terrified him, his features fell back into place. His glove, when he placed his hand to his forehead, came away damp. He shook himself, shuddering. "Oh, bad dream. Sorry. It must have been. You were screaming." Susan turned to stare at him. "You feeling better?" She did not see the two glaring balls of light that were approaching from the opposite direction. Her eyes were all for him. He was still sitting bolt upright, rigid. The rigidity was no longer the result of his dream, however. If she had not seen the approaching headlights, he had. The headlights were coming on with a rush, and they were directly ahead. He was bracing himself instinctively, attempting to protect himself from the crash that was inevitable. "Look out!" Maitland lunged for the wheel. For an instant she fought him for it, not comprehending, but he was too strong for her. Two black streaks grew on the roadway behind the car as it swerved and skidded. This time the car did not come to a halt on the shoulder. It shot like a bullet across the shoulder and through the guardrail, plunged down an embankment and tore across level ground toward a clump of trees, saplings that it snapped like matchwood, scattering bits and pieces of itself with each impact. But the impacts were not enough to slow it. It sped on, turned over and over as it struck, glancingly against a boulder, righted itself, and hurtled directly at a large oak. Maitland watched the oak through the broken windshield, hypnotized. He had been aware of the whirling of the car, of Susan whirling beside him, and his screams had matched hers. But the certain realization of what was to happen next froze him with his lips still parted. The oak was growing swiftly larger, leaping directly at him. He heard the crash when the car struck. Susan too had stopped screaming by then, and there was no other sound. He saw the hood of the car fly open, buckle in upon itself. He felt the impact, felt himself lifted, thrown, then darkness engulfed him. He lay on his back with his arms outflung, unmoving. Above him, the leafy branches of trees waved their silhouettes, now hiding, now revealing, the stars that dotted the black sky. Nothing else stirred. The branches and the stars were the first things he saw when he opened his eyes at last, but he did not recognize them for what they were. There were merely jumbled shadows and points of light above him that he did not understand. He stared up almost curiously, wondering. It was a long time before he was able to comprehend that he was lying on his back and that the points of light were stars glimpsed through the leaves. Realization of what had taken place came slowly. By turning his head a little to the side, he could see the still smoking wreckage of his car crumpled against the trunk of the oak. Turning his head was an effort. He wondered dazedly if his spine were injured. Susan had been with him. He had not expected that he would be able to move, to get to his feet, yet, miraculously, unbelievably, his arms and legs functioned. He was able to stagger to the car, to try to see inside it. The car had collapsed, compressed itself. In the darkness he could not even be certain where the door on the driver's side had been. The door had folded inward, and the roof of the car had come down to meet it. When he did find the door at last, he could see nothing behind it until he had picked up a stone and smashed a hole through what was left of its glass. Amazement widened his eyes. The car was empty. A hysterical giggle was born and died in his throat. Susan was hiding from him, teasing him. The insane thought would not leave him. "Susan?" He had not expected that his voice would be a grating rasp. The sound startled him, brought him back to reality. "Take it easy. Easy. Susan had to be somewhere. She might need help." He forced himself to think methodically. The car had come that way, through those broken saplings. If Susan had been thrown clear, she would be lying somewhere along that path. He walked stiffly past the broken-off stumps of saplings, searching as he went. There was nothing along the path except the deep ruts made by the car's wheels, nothing within 20 yards on either side of it, only bits and pieces of tree trunk scattered like spent projectiles. He retraced his steps, cursing the time he had wasted. Fool! He should have made a more thorough search of the area immediately around the wreck. His feet sank into the soft earth with every step. That was probably what had saved him from injury. The ground here was like a sponge. At the wreck, he had to rest. Walking was more of an effort than he had thought. His body responded to his will only grudgingly. "She's got to be here. Somewhere." His tongue, like his body, was difficult to manage. He had heard that shock did strange things to the nervous system. But he should be thinking of Susan, not himself. There was a clump of bushes not far from where he stood. He searched it inch by inch, kicking in frustration at the tall weeds that hid the spongy ground. He found nothing, emerged on the far side of the bushes, circled them to come back to the car. Perhaps over there, beyond the wreckage. Except for a blanket of old leaves, the ground beyond the car was bare. "Susan?" He said it uncertainly, the fear that was growing in him making his tongue even more wieldy. "Susan!" He moved back and forth, quartering the area like a hunting dog. "Susan! Answer me!" She did not answer. She was gone, vanished, disappeared like a puff of smoke. He had no choice but to admit to himself, finally, to lean against the tangled remains of the car with his throat tight and the fear gnawing at him like cancer. He heard the sound from the road only faintly. It was still far off, but it grew rapidly until it filled his head. A car! There was a car coming along the road. He ran, stumbling. Anything was better than standing here. Anything was better than being alone. That was what he was feeling. Loneliness. A terrible, aching loneliness. It wasn't just fear, just not being able to find Susan that had set him to trembling. He had to tell someone what had happened. Ask someone what had happened. The muck underfoot clutched at his feet, tripped him. Climbing up the embankment to the broken fence was an effort that made him gasp for breath, that clouded his vision. He had to force himself to claw his way up the last few inches to where his car had shot off the road. Even when he stood on the road, he could not see clearly. His view along the dark ribbon showed him nothing. Perhaps he had only imagined that he had heard a car approaching. Stupid. Stupid. The car was coming the other way. Paired beams of light probed the darkness, swelling rapidly larger and more intense. Maitland wanted to shout, to dance up and down, to wave. He staggered to the centre lane of the road, opened his mouth, and his voice failed him. But he was standing directly in the car's path. Its headlights caught him, outlined him like a moth pinned to black velvet. Somehow it took all his remaining strength. He managed to hold up a gloved hand. The car, a sedan, was almost on him now. In another moment it would be unable to stop in time to keep from hitting him. The driver saw him, slammed a panicked foot on the brake. The sedan's tyres screeched protestingly, but they held the road. The sedan came to a stop. The man behind the wheel gulped. It had been a near thing. Then anger stained his cheeks a deep red. He leaned out of the car with his eyes glaring. "You crazy fool! Do you want to get yourself killed?" The man was still shouting, his mouth wide open. It remained open while the anger in his face turned to a look of stark horror. It took only an instant. Maitland took a step forward. "Look, please!" The man shrieked. His mouth closed, opened, closed again, the mouth of a fish out of water. The sedan slammed into gear, leaped forward so suddenly and unexpectedly that a fender brushed Maitland's sleeve as it rushed him by. No, wait! The sedan was already far down the road. Maitland could not think clearly. Crazy. It was crazy. After a while he began to walk, following the sedan. His journey seemed interminable. How long he walked, his legs betraying him every now and then so that he fell heavily, would have been impossible to say. But every step forward was a step toward the city. Somewhere, diagonally off in the distance, there was a flicker. He could see it, yellow and orange through the bushes that grew thickly there. Headlights? No, that was impossible. A house? No. A fire? Someone had built a campfire. Maitland slid down the embankment. The spongy earth would not support him. Near the bottom his feet shot out from under him so that he tumbled the rest of the way head over heels, but he did not care. Ahead the ground was almost a meadow. The fire flickered through the bushes beyond it, a beacon toward which he ran prayerfully. It was only when he had reached the bushes that he thought to use caution. It would not do to frighten whoever was there. He moved through the bushes carefully, not making any noise, until he could see the fire and the man who had built it. The fire was a small one, darting through the chinks in the ring of stones that had been arranged to confine it. 3 sticks made a tripod above the flames, and, hanging from the tripod, was a tin can suspended from a bit of wire. Steam was rising from the can. The man who had built the fire and the tripod was facing Maitland. Maitland could see the blue-black stubble of beard on his jaw, the torn coat that flapped about him on the damp ground as he used a twig to stir whatever was in the can. A tramp. The tramp did not move when Maitland parted the bushes and stepped out into the open. He was intent on his cooking. Maitland had almost reached him before he looked up. Maitland held out a hand placatingly. "Don't be afraid. I only want to—" There it was again. That look, amazement and terror. In a moment, the tramp would run. He was on his feet, backing away, not knowing and not caring that one of his legs brushed the tripod of sticks and overturned it so that it fell into the fire and sent up a small shower of sparks. Maitland got no further. The strangled whimper that came from the tramp's blue-black lips chilled even him. "Get away! Get away from me!" And the tramp was off and running before Maitland could so much as withdraw his placating hand. His gurgles of fear drifted back to Maitland as he fled. Maitland could hear them long after the tramp had disappeared into the shadows. Maitland did not attempt to think, to understand. The effort was too great. Instead, he stumbled back to the embankment. Clinging it was torment that sucked the energy from him and left him weak and exhausted again. At the top, on the highway, he gulped air greedily until his chest had stopped heaving. What seemed like an hour later, or was it really only a few moments, he could hear the sound of another car approaching. The road bent here, and he could not yet see the car, but presently its headlights became visible. Maitland ran out into the middle of the road long before the car was near. He was standing there, signalling frantically, when the car raced toward him along the straight stretch of concrete on which he stood, and then began to slow down. He could not see the driver. The glare of the headlights was in his eyes, but if he had, he would have seen that it was a young woman, little more than a girl, and he would have cringed away from the grin of terror and repugnance that spread over her face and drained the blood from her lips. He moved as swiftly as his protesting body would permit. 6 steps took him to the side of the car. He could see the girl now. The hand he reached toward her was meant to calm, to soothe. It did neither. The girl sagged in a faint. As before, he did not attempt to think or understand. He had given up trying to understand. The girl's unconscious body was limp as he pushed her to the far side of the seat and got behind the wheel. Moving her was an incredible effort, but he managed. He drove straight ahead. His foot pushed down hard on the gas pedal so that the speedometer needle climbed to 70 and hung there. In a half hour there were houses along the road. Then he was on the outskirts of the city. The girl still lay unmoving. No one saw her. There was no one to see. At this hour the city was a desert of stone and brick canyons, dark except for the pools of yellow light shed by the arc lamps overhead. He was on his own street when the girl stirred for the first time. He stepped even harder on the gas pedal. The car lurched when he braked to a halt in front of his house. If he had been thinking clearly after he had left the car and gone to the door, he would not have reached at once for the bell. He would have remembered the girl, the tramp, the driver of the first car. He would have remembered how the sight of him had affected them. But he was not thinking clearly. There was only the need in him, the loneliness. He rang the doorbell and waited in an agony of suspense. After an interval, he heard footsteps inside the house. Footsteps that he recognized. His wife's footsteps. The door opened, bathing him in brilliance. His wife stood with her hands still on the knob. She drew in her breath and took a step backward. The horrified expression that he had come to know so well took her face and twisted it into a clown's grimace of impossible revulsion. Her lips parted to give voice to a shattering scream. Maitland wanted to scream too, but he had to hang on to his sanity, to soothe her. The door slammed in his face. His wife's hysterical, convulsing sobbing drifted back to him through the door as she fled. It couldn't be happening. No, not again. He banged on the door, knowing that it was hopeless, whirled to stare through the living room window. He gaped stupidly. He could see into almost every corner of the living room, but his eyes remained riveted on his wife. She burst into the room with tears of fright coursing down her cheeks and, still sobbing, ran across to the man who had been seated in Maitland's easy chair. The man was a stranger to Maitland. He was in his shirt sleeves. He had been reading a newspaper, but he had gotten hastily to his feet. Maitland's wife ran to the man's arms and he held her comfortingly, talking to her. Maitland felt weak. His legs trembled. Only his hand, pressed against the wall by the door, supported him. The hand moved spasmodically, trailed across the wall as he turned from the window, brushed the name card in its neat metal frame. The doorbell. Where was the doorbell? He had to get in. This was where he belonged. That man inside, he was an interloper. Maitland's finger was on the doorbell, but he did not press it. His eyes had fixed on the name card. His eyes were the lens of a camera that moves in closer and closer on its subject. The card seemed to grow as he stared at it. The name on the card was not Maitland. The name on the card was Wilson. Maitland's finger fell away from the button. He was cold. He pulled his coat collar up about his ears and turned from the door to look along the windy, deserted street. Hesitantly he began to walk, slowly at first, then faster. It took another half hour to reach the other street where he had stood earlier. This street, too, was deserted. But the wind was just as penetrating, the night just as empty. He stood in front of Susan's house for minutes, feeling the cold, before he looked up hopelessly to her window. It was dark. He did not know really why he had come. If he had a reason, if he hoped to find surcease here, he was not aware of it. There was merely a compulsion in him, a desire that had directed his footsteps to the only haven that still remained to him. He went in, rode the elevator to Susan's floor, walked the familiar 20 paces to her apartment. Before he rang the doorbell, he peered carefully at the nameplate above it. That, at least, had not changed. The name on the plate was still the same. Blake. He pressed the doorbell, knowing that it was futile. It made no sense, but the compulsion was still in him. He could not have kept himself from pressing the button even if he'd wanted to, even if it still mattered. There was a sound behind the door. Susan opened the door and looked squarely into his eyes. Her voice was calm, Not hysterical, not afraid. She stared at him, and her expression did not change. "Yes? Susan!" His voice was a gasp of disbelief. "Who is it?" He had to struggle to keep calm, to keep from shouting, "It's me! Carl!" Something was wrong. Susan was staring at him, but she did not seem to recognize him, and her face was changing, twisting into the expression of fear that had become so hateful to him. "You can't be!" He would not be turned away again. It was too much to expect him to bear. He pushed past her into the living room. The room was completely furnished. Every chair and table was in its accustomed place, carpeting covering the floor, pictures hung on the walls. The furniture! You had it He spoke before he was able to remember that it was impossible. Susan had remained by the door, the fear still etched into her face. "I had it brought back. After the car crash. The crash in which I was blinded and Carl was killed. 2 years ago." She was still staring at him, but he knew now why she had not seemed to recognize him. "Killed? 2 years ago?" He said it stupidly, not really believing, yet something of her fear communicated itself to him. He spun away from her. There was a mirror on the wall behind him, reflecting his face that was not a face, that was hardly more than a skull with decayed flesh peeling away from it. A face that had a hole for a nose, a mouth that was 2 rows of bare teeth that opened as he watched and screamed and screamed and screamed. The face vanished. Suddenly he was no longer standing. He was sitting bolt upright in a car, and Susan was sitting beside him. Ahead of him, through the windshield, he could see a long ribbon of road stretching away ahead to lose itself in the darkness. His face was contorted. For a moment it remained so. Then, as he began to realize where he was, his features fell back into place, but the horror of his dream remained with him. He could feel the trickle of cold perspiration running down his cheek from his forehead to lose itself under his collar. The shudder that shook him made his whole body tremble. "Are you all right?" Susan did not take her eyes from the road, but her voice was concerned. "Yeah, of course. It's just a nightmare." Even his lips were trembling. "Oh." This time she did look at him. "I rather thought so. You seem to be trying to cry out. It must have been a bad one." Yeah, it was." That much he was able to say, and no more. There was a car coming the other way. "Susan! Look out! That car!" Too late. Susan had whirled back to the road, but she was blind, the headlights of the other car glaring directly into her eyes. He could tell by the way she froze. "Susan!" She was staring straight ahead, paralyzed. His desperate lunge slammed her out of the way, but her fingers had locked onto the wheel. He had to fight her for it. "Susan! For God's sake!" He tried desperately, and heard the nerve-shattering screech of the tyres as the car skidded and went out of control. Just for an instant he had a glimpse of the white guardrail, and then the rail was gone, obliterated as the car smashed through it. He was only vaguely aware of the rest, of the car turning over and over, of the final bone-crushing impact when it struck the trunk of a huge tree and flung him free like a rag doll. Then there was only blackness. It was the cold dampness of the ground that wakened him at last. In time, he opened his eyes. Even that was an effort, and for a while he did not attempt to think. He was lying face up, and it was night. That much he knew, but where he was, why he was here, eluded him. It was not until he saw the wreckage of the car that he remembered. He could move his head by then, just a little, and he could see the broad swathe that the car had cut through the saplings that grew here as it careened down from the road. An accident? He'd been in an accident, and he hadn't been alone. Somehow, unbelievably, he was on his hands and knees. Somehow he was able to reach the pile of torn and twisted chrome and sheet metal that had brought him here. In the darkness, the pile was an impossible jumble. It took minutes to find what was left of the window and the driver's side, and when he peered inside and croaked, "Susan," there was no response. His hand, groping through the shattered window, found nothing. There was something familiar about the hysterical giggle that was born and died in his throat. Susan was still in the car, hiding from him. "Susan?" His own voice startled him, brought him back to reality. Susan had to be somewhere. She might need help. The car had come that way, through those broken saplings. If she had been thrown clear, it had happened somewhere along that path. He walked stiffly past the broken-off stumps of the saplings, searching as he went. There was nothing. He went back the way he had come, his feet sinking into the soft earth with every step. That was probably what had saved him from injury. The earth was spongy. At the wreck he had to rest. Walking was an effort. His body responded to his will only grudgingly. She's got to be here. She's got to be here somewhere. His tongue, like his body, was difficult to manage. He had heard that shock did strange things to the nervous system. There was a clump of bushes a few feet from where he stood. He searched it inch by inch, kicking in frustration at the tall weeds that hid the spongy ground. He found nothing, emerged on the far side of the bushes, circled to come back to the car. Perhaps over there, beyond the wreckage. Except for a blanket of old leaves, the ground beyond the car was bare. "Susan!" He moved back and forth, quartering the area like a hunting dog. "Susan! Answer me!" She did not answer. She was gone, vanished, disappeared like a puff of smoke. He had no choice but to admit that to himself finally, to lean against the wreckage of the car with his throat tight and the fear gnawing at him like a cancer. He heard the sound from the road only faintly. It was still far off, but it grew rapidly until it filled his head. There was a car coming along the road. He ran, stumbling. Anything was better than standing here. Anything was better than being alone. That was what he was feeling. Loneliness. A terrible, aching loneliness. The muck underfoot clutched at his feet, tripped him. Climbing up the embankment to the broken fence was an effort that made him gasp for breath, that clouded his vision. He had to force himself to claw his way up the last few inches to where his car had shot off the road. Even when he stood on the road, he could not see clearly. His view along the dark ribbon showed him nothing. Perhaps he had only imagined that he had heard a car approaching. Stupid! The car was coming the other way. Paired beams of light probed the darkness, swelling rapidly, larger and more intense. He wanted to shout, to dance up and down, to wave. He staggered to the centre lane of the road, and his voice failed him. But he was standing directly in the car's path. Its headlights caught him, outlined him like a moth pinned to black velvet. Somehow, it took him all his remaining strength, he managed to hold up a gloved hand. The car, a sedan, was almost on him now. In another moment it would be unable to stop in time to keep from hitting him. The driver saw him, slammed a panicked foot on the brake. The sedan's tyres screeched protestingly, but they held the road. The sedan came to a stop. Maitland sobbed. It was the screeching of the tyres that did it. The sound was like a key opening the door to damnation. He remembered now. Everything that he had done since awakening on the seat beside Susan had happened before. In a moment, the driver of the car would lean out of his window and a look of stark horror would widen his eyes, make his jaw grow slack. But what happened after that? Maitland could not remember. What followed was horrible, agonizing. That much he knew, but no more. He had to wake up. He had to break the sequence. He would hide his face. The driver would not be able to see him. He did not hide his face. The thought was already gone. He could remember only the accident, that he had been looking for Susan, and that Susan was gone. The man behind the wheel gulped. It had been a near thing. Then anger stained his cheeks, a deep red. He leaned out of the car with his eyes glaring. You crazy fool! Do you want to get yourself killed? The man was still shouting, his mouth wide open. It remained open while the anger in his face turned to a look of stark horror. It took only an instant. Maitland took a step forward. Look, please! The man shrieked. His mouth closed, opened, closed again. The mouth of a fish out of water. The sedan slammed into gear, leaped forward so suddenly and unexpectedly that a fender brushed Maitland's sleeve as it rushed by him. After a while, Maitland began to walk, following the sedan. So that is why you are in a hurry. Maitland brushed a hand over his eyes. It seemed to him that he had been alone on a dark road. But that was impossible. He was still in the catacombs, still staring at the monk, and the monk was speaking slowly, ironically. That is why you are in a hurry. What do you mean? He had to think, to clear his head. To leave your wife? Your children? No one knew about that. Only Susan. How do you... Who are you? I assure you, I have a purpose. The monk did not seem to turn, yet somehow he was facing the young man who had sat close to Joanne. Younger than the others, still in his 20s, the young man had remained silent until now, almost arrogant despite his fear. But he could not keep that fear from sounding in his voice when he spoke. What sort of game are you playing? Game? You're trying to frighten us in some way. What do you want? To show you something. Something in your own mind. Something that you're capable of doing. Circles of light. The monk's eyes were circles of light. No, I don't want to know. There were pictures inside the circles now. No. Oh, but you must know. The pictures were growing clearer, clearer. You must know. Carl Maitland's fateful story, Reflection of Death, was written by Jack Oleck and narrated and sound edited and mixed by Chris Harvey. Coming soon, stay tuned when I will be bringing you even more Tales from the Crypt with James Eliot's fateful story, Poetic Justice.